Okay, welcome everyone. Here we are, 4 o'clock Friday afternoon. So, as I know from yesterday when I was sitting in your seats at 4 o'clock, I was waning a bit. Can we just stand up just for a moment? I'm not going to make you do any exercises, but I just want everyone, just if you're able, please, just do some stretching. Reach to the sky. Let's just take a couple of nice deep breaths. Again, we here are the barrier to your libation of choice at 5 o'clock. So let's all get there. I appreciate you standing up. So thank you very much. I and my partner, we are going to be doing our very college best to be engaging and keep you all awake. So why are we here? We are here. Come on in. We're going to talk about the procurement process for wheelchairs, understanding the current process regionally to create a global consistency. So that's a lot of words. That is a lot of words. Before we get to the meat of our presentation, we are going to do our disclosure statement. So before I start, unfortunately, Rachel Fabiniak cannot be here today. She is in Australia, and we miss her terribly. However, she is a full-time employee at Permobil. She works as a director of clinical sales. She is based, as I mentioned, in Australia for Asia Pacific. So my colleague, my esteemed colleague, Jennifer Bernstein, she's a full-time employee at Permobil. So I'm reading this because I have to remember what she does. She's the clinical affairs manager based in Atlanta, Georgia. And my name is Stefan Morin. I'm a clinical educator for Permobil. I am based on the east coast of Canada. And so we'd just like to say that this presentation is generic in nature and is not related to Permobil specific products. So I feel like we all have to check a box that we all agree to these terms so that we can move on. Okay, so again, why are we here? So we are hoping, if I can keep you all awake, and Janet, that you can identify 3 barriers to client-centered wheelchair provision and current procurement process of wheelchairs from 2 regions or countries, and actually we made it to 5 countries. So we wrote these before we actually got to have this finished. So we're also going to be identifying 2 potential future steps for creation of a global wheelchair service provision guide. And lastly, we're going to specify at least 2 practical tips to the provision of wheelchair services in less than ideal circumstances. So again, who do we have in the audience? Just a quick poll. OTs, do we have some OTs in the house? Represent. Do we have some physios? Physios in the house? Represent, okay. How about some medical suppliers? Medical suppliers, nice. Do we have any end users? Any end users? Any other healthcare, allied health professionals? Stephanie? Fantastic, very cool. Right on, okay. Anyone else? Did I miss anyone? We're all good? Okay. Oh, Kevin, sound engineer. Actually, you know, Kevin, true professional. He's helping us out. Okay, so I'm going to pass over the presentation to Jenith. And your microphone is right there. Oh, you need the clicker, right?
So we wanted to give you just a very brief overview of, if you are a clinician in the room or an equipment provider, you probably experience one of these steps on a daily basis. We were provided with this map as a result of global input from a wide variety of clinicians. And even though you may work in a different location, in a different setting, in a different role from time to time, we all are going to experience some of these phases that you see on the screen in front of you. You're going to have some type of assessment and evaluation. Maybe it's after you've driven 400 miles somewhere, or maybe it's when you walked out of your door and went right down the street to a very nice, air-conditioned clinic, or whether you're in a very less resourced community. You're going to have to do some type of equipment training and education associated with the equipment that you assess and provide. And then there should also be some type of follow-up. Now that may be in person, maybe virtually, maybe a phone call. It doesn't always have to look exactly the same, but no matter where you practice or provide, you're going to have these similar steps. And throughout this presentation, we're going to talk about similarities, but also differences that you may encounter depending on where you're practicing or where you're providing equipment. One thing that actually it's kind of nice having a presentation towards the end of the conference, because there's been so much information we've learned already throughout the presentations and the plenary. We actually learned about the document that we are discussing on this slide here, which is upcoming. It's a World Health Organization wheelchair service standard, and I just learned after the plenary that this will be available in 2 weeks from the WHO, and it might be a guideline and not a standard. They were still kind of going back and forth on the terminology, but regardless of when it comes out or what it's actually titled, the goal of this is to really take what the WHO has already provided us to understand service delivery in less resourced communities, and really try to understand how can we come to a global consensus to develop some type of standard that will work globally, but within the context of healthcare systems. So typically we have those less resourced communities that don't have a stepwise approach, but they might benefit from understanding that stepwise approach. The goals are to set really minimum guidelines, inform and support effective planning, and to really strengthen the access to appropriate equipment, not just what happens to be available, but appropriate equipment for each individual. Forgot I have a clicker in my hand. So we can do all that, right? That sounds easy. I'm so glad the World Health Organization took that on and not us, because I don't think they're going to have an easy job of it, easy go of it, because we all face challenges. In that nice, colorful therapist journey, we didn't really put any speed bumps in your way. However, quite a few speed bumps might exist. Now, not everybody could experience all of these, but we know that there are a wide variety of training and experience levels, access to continuing education, understanding of funding sources, access to funding, period, understanding the clinical decision-making process when someone needs more complex equipment. And then, you know, that whole like time thing that we all have so much of to just do whatever we want. Time can also be a factor. You may not have appropriate time to complete comprehensive solutions that you would like. So, you know, there are perceived factors that can limit the access to doing the service provision in a stepwise plan. So we're going to talk about, again, how we can navigate some of these challenges and what we see across the globe.
So what are some of the process, what are some of the current issues? And really, when I started doing some of the research to prepare for this presentation, you know, finding this, getting the right chair, doing it right, doing it the right way, making sure that we're getting the right device for that end user, that continues to be a challenge globally. And so I found this really interesting article that surveyed lots of occupational therapists in Canada, as well as all 12 occupational therapy schools in Canada. And so taken from one of these surveys to a particular group of OTs in one of these provinces in Canada, they found from the respondents that a third of those respondents felt unprepared to be able to provide wheelchair services to their clients as well as to their caregivers. Okay, and then within the same article, another survey which was provided globally, 30% of respondents stated that they were unprepared to deliver wheelchair skills training, and 24% felt or reported that they had or felt that they had inadequate professional training. So, you know, this is a barrier.
So The catalyst really for this presentation came when we came across this position paper by Gowan and colleagues, along with a lot of excellent researchers, a lot of who are here at this conference. And they really addressed in 2021 the lack of evidence-based wheelchair provision guidelines across the globe, and the making sure that everybody has equal access regardless of their settings, their government funding, and their policies. They really wanted to identify what were the key aspects and what vision can we take away from these challenges to move us forward. And so they came up with these 5 positions. I think if you are already or have been practicing in seating and mobility for quite a while, these may be somewhat understandable to you, but the goals were no matter what stage in life an individual is in, they have equal access to the correct piece of equipment that's required for them. They are provided that equipment by a trained and competent workforce. The products that they're provided go beyond just meeting basic standards, but really always trying to elevate the bar of what type of equipment is available to them as appropriate by their resources and in their setting. Yes, we have to understand and respect the funding in order to make some of this successful. There are many regions where there is zero funding. So you have to understand that limited access to that support can limit some of the choices possibly, or how does that influence our decisions? And then also, even though this is really important, and number 5, key priority, there is really limited access to these types of policies that apply across the globe. So since we operate in a variety of time zones across the globe, we said, let's pool our resources, let's take all of our different levels of experience, see what we can learn from each other. Some of us come from backgrounds where we've had a lot of resources at our disposal, and some of us do not. Stefan is gonna share some really amazing experiences that he had in rural Newfoundland.
No, New Brunswick.
Oh, New Brunswick.
But you said Newfoundland right,
Okay,
so that's
okay.
good.
I'm learning my Canadian terms, so. But Stefan will share that with you. Rachel, who also created this presentation for you guys, she was trained in the United States, now works throughout the Asia Pacific region. And then myself, I also have a background in US funding. I'm now in a global role, and wow, eyes opened to our challenges here in the US and very similar and maybe more or less challenges throughout the globe. I've also myself provided equipment in less resource settings. So this topic really allowed us to pool our educational opportunities and figure out how we can share that with you if you don't have this information available to you. So the first thing that we really wanted to do is, echoing what Stefan stated about the survey with clinicians in Canada, we wanted to do our own survey of a variety of countries to see what they experience and what their challenges might be, so we could try to maybe someday be part of the solution. So we had 5 different countries that participated with a total of 316 participants. Pretty good. We would always love to have more, so you can never have enough, I don't think, from a participant standpoint. And so we had representation from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Taiwan, and the US. None of the questions were forced, and so there were some participants who chose not to answer each question. So the first question that we wanted to ask was reflective on that training. How did you know what you know? How did you find out how to be this skilled specialist in seating and mobility? Or maybe you aren't a skilled specialist. Maybe you're a generalist who's asked to do some of these responsibilities. So the first thing that we're going to highlight here, and there's a lot of different things that we can interpret, but we won't spend time on every single one of these bars. But I do want to highlight that Canada has the report of having the highest amount of university education. And I know from my own personal experience, it was very limited. I know that is, and Stefan as well, I know that that's changing in a lot of the programs, a lot of you who teach these programs, but of the therapists that we polled, Canada was leading the charge there. New Zealand, US being on the lower end. One of the things that you can see is that the internal and external course training is critical. So including some of these new grads, including some of these new clinicians in conferences like this to pique their interest, to get them excited, they need access to this information, whether virtually or in person. One thing that you might notice is here from our participants from Taiwan, they reported that they did not receive a lot of training through mentorship. And in speaking with Rachel, who does have that Asia Pacific knowledge, she mentioned that in Taiwan, there are very specific assistive technology centers. Depending on the population in a town, they will have a very dedicated place where they go for all of their technology needs. So you don't go typically to your general clinician and ask them to provide you with the wheelchair. So there's trained specialists and they kind of stay within that center. So they're not kind of going out and branching out into the rest of the clinical world that is present in that country. That's our assumption, of course. We didn't speak to each individual, but that's our assumption from what we know. And they also don't do quite as much rural outreach. So we thought we would just get kind of a pulse on how much equipment are they really providing. In our participants from Australia, we have where within a month's time, they might provide less than one wheelchair, which actually they will provide maybe 3 to 4 a year, but within any given month, they may not provide even one wheelchair. But of course, along the course of a year, they may provide like 3 or 4. We can see in the US, we have a kind of a broader distribution here of how many wheelchairs people provide within a month. And what we assume from this data is that in Australia, it's a much more generalized wheelchair provision process. All clinicians have to be at the ready to provide these complex solutions, whereas as we see in the US, typically, we have the opportunity to have more specialized seating and wheeled mobility clinics, especially in more metropolitan centers. And so when you have a more specialized clinic, you're seeing a higher amount of individuals who need this equipment. So through this survey, once we did kind of those basic demographics, I say we, once you did the basic demographics, we wanted to provide a case example to the participants to ask them, hey, here's some general information about an individual. We kept it quite vague. I know you don't need to read through every single thing, but we gave them just enough to allow them to be creative with what they wanted to recommend. And so we provided them with this clinical example or case study, and then we asked them, okay, given this limited amount of information, what do you do? What type of wheeled mobility solution is going to be the best match for this person? Understanding not a substitute for an in-person eval, mat eval, all of that, but just to get a brief overview. And so we asked them to consider their current funding climate and what equipment would they recommend. So, quite an interesting overview, a variety of reports that I can kind of let you guys take in a little bit here. But if we asked, so again, Miss Rossi here, am I saying that right?
Yeah, I think so.
Miss Rossi, she does have muscular impairments throughout her throughout her lower extremities and upper extremities. She is weaker on the left side of her body. She has limitations in her left upper extremity from a range of motion standpoint, and she does experience left upper extremity pain. She wants to be independent. She wants to be able to go out in her community to volunteer, access a train system within her community. So just a few kind of things to keep in the back of your mind. So within Australia, in our blue here, hopefully those colors are translating okay, but all the way to the left of each column, actually, no, they didn't recommend a folding or a manual or a rigid manual wheelchair at all for this individual. If they were going to provide a manual wheelchair at all, it was with a power assist solution. So no, they did not think that a manual wheelchair without power assist would be a good option for this individual. Compare that with the US, where almost 20% of respondents said that this person should have a manual wheelchair. And for those of you in the US, we specifically did not say what code of wheelchair because that's not universal terminology. Not everybody says lightweight, ultra lightweight, K4, K5, so we just said folding rigid. And then kind of interesting to see here we divided out power wheelchair tilt only, power wheelchair tilt and elevate, and then power wheelchair with multiple power seat functions. And one observation that we had for Canada, which is in the green here, is that we see a slightly lower multiple power seat functions, and then we do power wheelchairs with tilt and elevate. If you are not aware, in Canada, each province has very specific funding, and a lot of times power seat functions can be more challenging to provide to individuals, especially seat elevate is one of the limitations, but multi-power can vary by province. So we're anticipating that's why we saw a little bit of that variability. So what happens when you enter into utopia and you no longer care who's paying the bills and how much it costs? So we asked them to reconsider, Ms. Rossi, and what would you do now? You can choose your own adventure, right? What kind of equipment do you want to provide? So if you take if you look at this just from a colorful standpoint, we see, what do we see? A lot more in the power side, a lot more towards the right side. Very little in terms of just manual mobility. Pretty much you saw a shift from more just manual mobility to more manual mobility with power assist, as well as a shift from tilt only, right, to tilt and elevate, and to tilt with multiple seat functions. And we know from what we experienced here in the US as well in certain provinces in Canada, that seat elevate is something that a lot of individuals can benefit from, but is often limited right now, hopefully not very soon, by funding. So we see an increase in recommendation of multi-power and in power seat elevate. Then we attempted here to make a very nice kind of graph to show you and compare and contrast. So one of the things that we wanted to highlight from a pre and post funding mindset is if you were to look at, let's say, the United States, when they had to consider funding, so US is in the orange here, burnt orange, when they did have to think with funding first or with funding on their mind, there was almost 20% that recommended a manual wheelchair with no other technology. And comparing that to this line now that is in the black, where we're about 43% would then change and actually have a power assist device provided to that same exact individual. Some of the other spikes that we can see are more of a transition from the single power to the multi-power, and we saw that in the last graph where these multi-power spikes are seen above what would have been recommended had funding been taken into consideration. And then once we knew what they would change, we just wanted to straight out ask, would you do something different if you didn't have to think about funding? 4 out of the 5 countries all said yes. Australia, just a little bit of an outlier. There was about 37% that said they would change what they would do, but Australia has a very unique funding system where they have great access to resources when a piece of equipment is functionally required. They don't have codes, they don't have diagnoses that specify you can only have this chair if you have this specific diagnosis. So as long as a clinician, typically, when there is a clinician that can functionally justify that equipment for an individual, they can typically secure funding. There is some gray area because it depends on who's reviewing your case. There can be people that are equally in need, that one person might get a denial and one person might not, but there's no prerequisites that we often are faced with in the United States. And then when we wanted to tie back into this World Health Organization global standard, we kind of asked, we didn't specify what type of resource that we would like to provide to them. We just said, hey, if there was something that could help you, would you like it? Would you use it? Would it be helpful if you aren't the person that has on-the-job training available, you don't have a mentor? And so we had 70.8% that said yes, they would like some type of resource to guide them through this provision process. We had only 2% that said no, but of course, since we left it vague, we had about 27% who were not quite sure. So as we kind of transition into how Stefan's going to share his experience, hopefully you can kind of see that there is a wide variety across different regions and across different settings. There are challenges, but we can learn from one another. And also it helps us to kind of understand if we were to see someone come into your clinic and you're a specialist and you do everything, by the book, by the RESNA wheelchair provision guide, and you look at an individual and question maybe why they were provided a certain solution, it could be due to 10 or 15 different barriers that clinician encountered, or perhaps like in a country like Japan, there's no clinician involvement, there's no ATP, there's no specialist, there's no funding, it's not considered a medical device, the doctor's just writing a prescription and they're going to a pharmacy. So if you were to encounter an individual in that setting, you would understand some of those limitations, and we can learn from each other and help each other to grow some of that support for access to equipment. So Stefan's gonna talk to you about his unique experiences.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. How are we doing? We doing okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so when Rachel and I got together initially to put together this project, I wanted to talk about something practical, because when I go to conferences, I want to have something that I can take away and maybe put into my practice almost right away. So everything I'm going to be talking about is definitely based on my experiences, so that's the caveat. But there is a tie-in to why we are sort of piecing these two sections together, because, and I'll get into, but first of all, I'd just like to talk about really, regardless of where you are providing those wheelchair services, be it in a clinic, which do tend to be in larger urban centers, which is great. You have access to an interprofessional team. However, wait times can be long in these clinics. But really, when we are providing wheelchair services, regardless of where we are providing it, really, we want to be, if possible, doing this process in that environment of use of that end user. It's a critical step in identifying those wheelchairs that will meet that end users and their individual needs. And really, if you're doing so without being able to provide a home assessment, there's a great risk of providing an inappropriate wheelchair that's going to end up in someone's garage. So how does that tie into rural communities? Well, those persons who live in rural communities can have difficulty accessing rehab services for multiple reasons. Lack of accessible transit, just having available clinicians with that service knowledge. So, and really, when we're talking about that wheelchair assessment, when we're talking about that mobility evaluation, that key to a successful first wheelchair assessment, that really does need to have that understanding of that relationship between that end user, the equipment that is involved and necessary for his or her needs and function, and the environment. So why am I talking to you today? I think it's actually very apropos of when I started in my journey as a therapist. I was living in a large urban center in Canada, in Toronto. I was practicing in a large rehab facility for those persons with spinal cord injury. I was working in the public system. But I am from the east coast of Canada. So what I did is, where's the laser pointer on this little jim jabber? On the side?
Nope. Right there.
Oh, this little doodad. So what I tell my American friends is I go to Maine and turn right. And that's where I grew up, and that's where I returned, because really one of the reasons I wanted to is I wanted to be able to provide the services that I had learned in this large urban center to the citizens of the province where I grew up. So I was hired by a private clinic, which is very interesting in Canada because we do have universal health care and we have a great publicly funded system, but we are seeing some privatization. And so I can tell you from firsthand experience that providing private wheelchair services in Canada can be difficult. So that was one of those paradigm shifts that I experienced. The other paradigm shift that I experienced is that I went to a community-based practice. I did not have, I had a clinic base, but I was tasked with going up into the more rural areas of New Brunswick. And I had a very complex caseload, and at the time, I was providing a lot of custom molded wheelchair systems, wheelchair seating and positioning systems. So that was my office. I would be driving average 140 to 200 miles one way to see my clients. Travel was not within my funding system. So the reason why I'm talking about this in terms of this service provision is that when I got hired by this private clinic, they had actually enveloped a smaller seating clinic. They were a clinic that provided more of a physio model. They were having clients coming in more on half-an-hour chunks. They in and out in the actual clinic. They were not used to having clinicians who were providing wheelchair services. And so when I started, I was thrown into the deep end of the pool, and they said, here's where you're going, good luck. And I was used to having a plinth. I was used to having all kinds of colleagues to draw upon their support. So I didn't have any kind of process. And so, again, preparing for this presentation, I found this article, Isaacson, 2011. I think it's really, really interesting. It was a qualitative study. She talked to 12 very experienced therapists in the United States. One of the themes that came out and was very much, I find, very relevant to this talk is that creativity and the ability to think outside the box are skills that these therapists have developed and utilized to overcome barriers. So I can tell you from experience, the first 6 months that I worked within this new paradigm shift were very difficult. There were a lot of crash and burns. There were a lot of inappropriate referrals. There was a lot of driving with not getting paid because of the fact that I was not able to provide that service, either because of poor referral and appointments, because that person didn't have the proper funding in place, lots of things. And so luckily, the team that I worked with and the clinic that had hired me, they were very open to change, and they were actually very much a proponent of the Sigma Lean business model system. And so I found a clinician I was working with, actually was a vendor, he turned me on to the WHO guide. And I read this and I thought, okay, well, I'm not working with clients in developing countries. However, I thought that this guideline really could very much help the clinic and the clients that we served. And so we got together as a team and we started applying these 8 steps. And so that's really what I'm going to talk about, is how we developed this sort of toolkit on how to help our clients. And so really and truly, when you're working in remote areas, did I mention that I'm driving about 140 to 200 miles one way? That's about a 3-hour drive. So for those Canadians, so I'm driving about 250, 300K one way. And again, we weren't getting paid to do that. And so you want to get it right. So really, challenges, travel distances, poor cell service. Again, I tell my kid, I have a 10-year-old, I said, in the olden days, Daddy didn't have a cell phone. Now I can't manage without a cell phone. But if you're practicing and you need Google to get you where you're going and you have no service, there can be some challenges, okay? And then, again, communication and planning are the key. Now, I think that's true regardless of where you practice and what kind of system that you're practicing within. However, when you are traveling those distances, preparation, preparation, preparation. What kind of equipment do you need? What kind of tools do you need? A lot of times when you're seeing these clients, they've not been seen by a therapist 5 years. They may not have been seen by a technician. They may not know who to call. You might be the last line of defense on helping to do some minor repairs so that you can actually adjust their brakes so that they're actually safe for their transfers because they've fallen several times. There's all kinds of stuff that I've seen. I'm not going to tell you some of my fun stories. But all of this comes really when you are kind of providing these services in these kind of environments, you really, really, really have to be talking to your team and preparing. Because, right, we all have time constraints, and we've talked about that. But, and I'm going to come into this, again, the WHO, the first step in this provision guide is that of referral and employment. So a lot of times, what we had to do as a clinic was we had to take the admin staff and we had to work with them, and we created an algorithm and a decision tree on, because they were the intake, they were the face of the clinic. They were getting the calls from the clients, and they were seeing if they were an appropriate referral. They didn't know what was an appropriate referral. And then they had to set the appointments. We had to teach them how long a best practice wheelchair seating and mobility evaluation was so that they could actually help make sure that I think the first couple, they're saying, well, you just need a half an hour, right? I'm like, no, I need an hour and a half at least. So, but once we got that in place, the other thing that we did, again, because we were in a private system, we were putting together an estimate list or sort of an estimate cost on what kind of referrals were coming in so that we could give our clients a reasonable choice. Because a lot of times our clients were calling us because there was a long wait list for the publicly funded system and they wanted to jump the queue and they were coming to us for our services. However, there is a bit of sticker shock. Again, Canadians don't know how much medical services cost usually because we have a nice little card in our pocket when we go to the hospital. So we wanted to, again, make sure that our clients understood again, we want to make sure we're being client-centered and allowing our clients to make a reasoned choice. So, according to the WHO Service Guide, object of good practice for referrals and appointments is ensuring that users have equitable access to wheelchair service delivery, increased efficiency and productivity of the service, and minimize waiting lists. So, again, having that administrative staff who understand the nature of seating and mobility services is key. And we're really lucky. We had a great team. We all were pulling in the same direction. And once we started getting sort of a common ground and understood what we had to do, in fact, sometimes I would take some of my admin staff with me so they saw what a typical wheelchair assessment looked like. But again, that understanding of logistics, because of this model that we worked within where we had no funding for travel, we had to have good logistics. We would stack up appointments in certain geographic areas because, again, we wanted to maximize our time and minimize our costs. And I'm going to tell you this, as part of this toolkit, I know it may seem silly, but getting a good solid set of directions can go a long way. And I'm going to give you an actual, one of the directions was, okay, you're going to take a left at the road with the crooked tree. And if you've gone too far, if you see in the field, if there are 3 cows, you've gone too far. If there's 2 cows, you're good. You're looking for the greenhouse, not the green and white house. Because I had the way I had my, I had a GPS set up at the time, and that thing would take me on snowmobile trails sometimes with my Ford Focus, which is not designed to go on. So really getting that, and again, it may seem silly, but that goes a long way because time is money, money is time. So what I've done is I've just kind of pieced together this kind of toolkit that I put together, an actual toolkit. And it really started by, and again, I'm telling you this, learn from my mistakes. Because having the necessary forms, you're driving 200 miles away and you need to get a signature in order to be able to get that funding for that client. If you do not have a consent form, if you do not have your wheelchair assessment form, I'll tell you, I've had to drive, again, not getting paid, I had to drive back to a client's house to get a signature. My boss was not happy with me. So every morning, every Monday morning, that was what I would do, is I would just refill my binder with all of my assessments, including outcome measures. I would put a lot of, I put my Braden scale in there. Sometimes I would have my always. I would have MMSE. I would have sort of some cognitive screens if I needed them. Prepared, be prepared. Lots of tools. Oh, before I go, seating assessment. The other thing that we really put into place in this clinic, we had several clinicians with different backgrounds, but one thing that I really insisted upon is that we use a common seating assessment form so that we had some consistency among the clinicians. And if we were to have to swap cases, or we, again, had some consistency. I think that's really important, too, is to use a seating assessment form and use it consistently. But here's just an example of some of the tools that I would take. I've actually put down an actual handout. I have a QR code that's going to come up on the next slide. But I used a lot of these tools, expect the unexpected. But I found really I was doing some very specific custom seating, so I would bring extra hardware parts. I would bring extra screws and washers. Again, you might be that last step before that client's wheelchair kind of half falls apart. Of course, I would always refer back to a technician, but it may take them time. And again, I wouldn't be doing repairs that were beyond and I didn't have a lot of expertise, but I did learn a lot. But I would also bring foam to be able to simulate some positioning if I had to. Monoflex support, great for doing some simulation of some positioning. Sometimes I'd be bringing an adapter pad or an LTV cushion if I needed to get a client on a firm surface and they had skin issues. Definitely had a first aid kit. One thing I did want to point out, I learned really, really quickly that having painter's tape is a great tool because again, you're never just doing a seating assessment when you're in someone's house. They need stuff in the bathroom. And so a lot of people would get upset if I put tick marks on their walls. So just putting a couple of ticks of painter's tape went a long way. So this was a great little tool. Anecdotally in Canada, we call this a love glove. What did we call it? A friction management tool, is what we call it. So well, we have these, so that was really, really great just for assessing cushions, seeing how people are seated. PPE was always really important. Roho pump, handheld programmers. If you're comfortable with programming, if you want to do some programming, again, in the field where your clients may not get access to that for many weeks, if not months, all kind of important. But here's that QR code. If you want to take a moment to scan, I appreciate that. That'll take you to that. If you want to come and see me after, I can always email it to you, and I believe I'm going to try to get it, and I apologize. I'll try to get it in the handout section here. But that will take you, so that's a more specific list of, so basically what I did was I took one of my vendors who does a lot of this work in rural communities. I took him to a hardware store. I gave him a shopping cart, and I says, here's my Visa. Put all the tools in there that you think I need. And he was good. He didn't do anything crazy. But in terms of being able to provide those seating assessments when you're not in a clinic, obviously, and I'm going to assume that we all have working knowledge of seating assessments, so I'm not going to go through the nitty-gritty. But really, we want to be able to get that client in a supine position. And ideally, a firm surface is used. I would take a massage table. I would say I probably used it once. A lot of my clients didn't feel comfortable. They couldn't transfer on and off it, or it didn't meet the weight capacity needs of my client. So I learned to improvise. So here's now this is a colleague, so I went and did a little photo shoot. So this is not an end user. I'll just be fully transparent. But a lot of times I would have admin staff, if I knew that it might make sense, I would actually have them have the appointment at the time that they would be in bed, so that I could have them in a supine position. I know assessing someone in a bed and on a mattress isn't ideal, but again, my mentor said, don't guess, assess. So it's better than nothing. So, but I've gotten clients on couches. I've done it on piano benches. here I am. Some of my clients didn't have a bed. So, but I've had clients who would sleep in their wheelchair. Again, not ideal, but if they had recline, if they had power elevating leg rests, you have to do what you have to do. Improvising is the key. Here I am. I'm actually assessing that hip to back angle. I'm palpating that PSIS and kind of seeing, I'm actually able to assess in that position where that pelvis is rotating, it's going back into PPT. It's not ideal, but you can definitely get a better idea of how you can configure that wheelchair. A lot of times, a lot of my clients were older adults and they just didn't have the endurance to do these transfers, and we just had to do it that way. I configured successfully a lot of chairs with this method. Another part of a seating assessment, obviously, is assessing a client's balance. So again, it's ideal to be doing it on a firm surface, but sometimes I couldn't get clients to get on a kitchen chair. They couldn't transfer, or they couldn't tolerate sitting on that hard of a surface, right? So here I am, again, using clinical judgment. Obviously, by the time I've gotten here, I've got an idea of that client's function. I've removed the backrest and the armrests because this particular client has good balance. So I'm actually able to get a good idea of not only what their balance is, but I'm reintroducing balance, gravity onto their posture, giving me more rich information. When I had clients that did not have the available balance, with their consent, I would sometimes have their caregiver support them from behind and can go through the same process. Or sometimes I would be bringing my ATP or my vendor with me and have him or her help me, again with the consent of my client, using clinical judgment. But these are ways that you can get that person, you can get as much of that information. Now, I would travel all the time because, as I mentioned, I was never just doing wheelchair assessments. I would, and Jeneth was teasing me, OT nerd, I would carry a bath transfer bench in my car. And what a great tool, height adjustable, padded, I have an arm rail and a backrest. I would be doing that kind of, a lot of this assessment sometimes. A lot of times my clients were comfortable sitting on this because they were transferring on those and using those for their ADLs anyway. So, and the great thing was mine wasn't wet.
I may have made fun, but I was also impressed.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
I would not have had that with me.
Fantastic. Well, I'm an OT nerd. So, and then also we have to be able to do our measurements. So here you see that my client, ideally, a firm surface is necessary, but you can see that he's actually he's kind of getting a little bit immersed into that cushion medium, and it actually skewed my results. So what I used to do is I would take a seat rigidizer, or I would take, and I would also take a transfer board. And if they could tolerate sitting on that firm surface, when I took these measurements on both these with these devices, I was actually off by ½ an inch when I wasn't using that firm surface. So these are just ideas that you can kind of get past. Okay, I love my calipers. Sometimes I would forget them. So, desperate times, necessity is the mother of invention. I would have clients hold books. Here, I didn't have access to books, so I just had this gentleman holding boxes against his greater trochanter's. I got a far better reading than if I'm just kind of guesstimating where those are. Here I am using clipboards. If my client didn't have the necessary upper extremity function with which to help me, I would have a caregiver help me do that. So again, using that bath transfer bench, because it's so open, it helped me. It was also another really great way to get those measurements. So those are just some of those kind of ideas that I learned the hard way, but really helped me successfully be able to provide these services. But, we use that guidelines not just for talking about assessments, but we also use this for other aspects of our process model within the clinic that I worked. So in terms of that prescription piece, right, we're using our clinical reasoning and applying information gathered during that assessment. So again, don't guess, assess. It's essential to clinical practice. But I found that we used, and again, this isn't anything that you, regardless of where you practice, having a set of hierarchy of goals, not just SMART goals, but a hierarchy of goals. Very helpful when we were working with complex wheelchair systems. I worked with a gentleman who said it's really easy to create new problems trying to solve a problem. But I found having a hierarchy of goals really helped the team remain client-centered. And that's something that I found that on all the sessions that I've been sitting in at this conference, we're all talking about being client-centered, right? And it's helping the management of expectation of the client their caregivers, sometimes other clinicians within. So another part of this 8 steps for the WHO is that funding and ordering. So making sure that the order or procure the wheelchair for the user as early as possible. So again, when we were talking about the referral and appointment, we would already be exploring funding options at that step, talking about what kind of funding do they have in place, and we didn't want to preclude our services if they didn't have funding, and so we would ask them to maybe problem solve, and sometimes I would definitely help, but use of servicing organizations like the MD Society, MS Society, Cancer Society, the Red Cross, GoFundMe, these were all explored. So we want to make sure that we can provide the equipment that is necessary for our client's function. 10 minutes. Yeah, I know, I'm going long. Oh my goodness. Okay, no, I appreciate that. Okay, I like to talk. So another step, product fitting and prep. Again, when you are 200 miles away, you have to make sure that you are prepared. Planning and communication with that vendor prior to that fitting is key. Again, learn from my mistakes. Making sure that everything that you've ordered, and this is when keeping really good documented notes is really good, getting there and you've forgotten one little piece, and again, you're not getting paid till you're actually providing that wheelchair, and you can't do it. What happens to that poor client? They're not going to get that. They're not going to get that wheelchair. So you want to make sure that you're going through all of this list with your client, with your vendor or your ATP. But the other thing is that making sure that you have everything set up as close to that demo. If you've used a demo, hopefully you have. Or again, sticking to those notes. I have sat in someone's kitchen for 3.5 hours reconfiguring a power wheelchair because we had the wrong seat to floor height. Learn from me, that really stank. Okay, training, another part of this WHO piece. Right, again, in my experience, that practical real-world experiences are far more effective than simulated experiences, right? And then that power wheelchair skills training can be provided to address some of the challenges new users face to mitigate potential risk to the users and others in his or her environment. And this, again, coupled with product prep, when you're providing this training, because these steps aren't, they're not all linear. You can do some of this training when you're using your demo, but this is a great time to be able to set up power seat functions, memory functions, independent repositioning modes. So again, and being able to do it in that person's environment so that you can actually do that, you can really teach them those skills within there so they can generalize those skills within their home is fantastic. And wheelchair skills accounted for 91.3% of the direct effect of self-efficacy on life space mobility. Follow-ups and repairs. I would almost have my calendar out before I even showed them, the client, their new wheelchair. And we'd be like, when are we coming back? Right? Because we want to make sure that we've met their goals and to address any new needs that have arisen since the last evaluation. The more complex the system, the closer you have to make your follow-up, especially if that person's 200 miles away. If they call you the next day and say, I can't transfer onto my toilet, that's a problem. Right? But the other part of this, again, we learned the hard way, is that follow-up and maintenance, you really have to be setting that up with that client and putting in place those strategies to help them problem solve. Who do I call if my wheelchair breaks down? If you're 200 miles away from the nearest technician, they're probably going to be in bed sometimes for weeks. So really setting that up and really having a good plan in place for that client and their caregivers is key. Because we're really, if that person has negative, if they're not able to get in their wheelchair, they're just not living their life. Their quality of life is in the toilet. So this is where that connected chair, if that person's in a wheelchair, is really key, because that really helps with that fleet management. If those technicians can really get an idea from, remotely what's going on with that person's wheelchair, that saves time. If they're driving and they understand that they can see whatever particular error code is coming up, or they understand perhaps it's a battery issue, if they can manage that without having to go, or they know what they have to bring, and again, who wins? The client. Outcome measures, really, again, regardless of where you practice, having objective set of measures to select and evaluate the wheelchair is key. Now, they don't always have to be standardized and validated outcome measures, although that helps. But again, use of digital photography, skills performance, again, that you're going to see within that client's home. That's great. I'm going to give a really quick story. Hopefully I have, oh boys, I'm going to go real quick. Outcome measures. I once did 5 complex custom seating systems in a nursing home. All these clients were nonverbal, but they verbalized a lot. We did all 5 in one day. We came back the next day, and the nursing care director came. She was at the door waiting for us, and she said, "What did you do? What did you do?" And we was like, "I don't know, geez, what do?" And we opened the door. It was quiet. It was quiet. She said, "It has never been quiet." And that was the best outcome measure I think I ever had. Was just, they were comfortable. They were well seated. Anyway, here's not an exhaustive list of functional outcome measures, but definitely I would have these within that kit that I would take with me, because sometimes you're not sure what you're going to see, but having access to some great wheelchair outcome measures and assessments are great. I think I put this list on that handout. So from the granular, let's scale it back to a global level, right? So how do we meet this global demand? I think it's through education, really. It's through that entry to practice education programs are pivotal in ensuring clinical competence. And that wheelchair sector education and training are critical to promoting best practice, right? And having a comprehensive wheelchair delivery process and a competent workforce is essential to ensure appropriate wheelchair service provision. So this ties right back into, yay, the WHO and their resources. I have put a link to this, and I have a link within that handout. But these are great resources, and again, these standards or these guidelines are coming out in a couple of weeks. So this is just great to be able to share information, and lots of great ways of hybrid models of education, because the same thing with the International Society of Wheelchair Professionals, who are actually having...
I was going to say, they're talking about their online modules right now.
They're next door. So I have a link down below, and again, I have that link on the handout. But again, a great way for us to share information, like what we're doing right now. But being able to share that information among therapists globally is fantastic. And really, again, kind of looking at that global, we're really pulling that focus out to those, that whole picture, between the manufacturer, the clinician, and the end user. We're all connected. We want to make sure that those manufacturers are continuing to raise their game and providing good products, making sure that they're going through ISO testing, that those clinicians are getting the education necessary, be it through university education, be it through those IWSP, through the WHO, sharing amongst yourselves. Who benefits? The end user, right? And the other thing that we were talking about in preparing for this is that, just because there are changes regionally, like within the United States, which is what's happening with
the seat elevate
exactly
reconsideration. Yeah.
Well, other countries are looking to you, including Canada.
Yeah.
That flows upstream. So changes that you're seeing regionally can become global changes, and so that's really exciting that we're seeing that, because hopefully end users, clinicians are all advocating for these service provisions.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. I wanted to also put a shameless plug that we do have representatives from Australia and Taiwan if you would like to ask any country-specific questions. But we couldn't have done that without our global support team
100%.
and Rachel, who's waking up in Australia.
That's
so,
right.
yeah, thank you guys for hanging with us, and hopefully take away some good stuff. And well.